In Older Worlds, a serial novel by Robert Goble. Part 1. Nancy Disappears. Forward. When my friends and readers ask me, "What's your new book about?" I admit I'm eager to fill their ears, hoping what I tell them will inspire the kind of urgency that would make them mark the dates on their calendars and invest in the latest ebook reader with the sole purpose of beginning the dark, somewhat disturbing new serial novel, a fantasy set in the west side of the Salt Lake Valley during the summer of 1984. It's a novel that draws heavily on the nostalgia of those days and seems to carry with it its own soundtrack. I would suggest Googling YouTube, 2 words unthought of at that time, or some other site that has quick accessible music, or simply digging out the old boxes full of the tapes and records of those fond times and playing them along. I hope you'll dive in, immersing yourself in the spirit of the times, and feel a little of what I felt scraping over the pavement of old memories with worn shoes and sore feet. And yet at times it was hard to come back to the present. Speaking of friends and readers, one in particular comes to mind. As I enthusiastically dragged him through the plot, staring inwardly into the visions of my own imagination, he kindly stopped me in mid-sentence and said, "You really ought to get out of Magna." After a silent pause, I clumsily tried to explain how I wasn't satisfied with how I had situated the story of my last novel across a harvested field in Magna, yet had only tiptoed around the township, timidly leaving out the richness of the community. I'd even left out the name of our beloved high school, substituting Magna in place of Cypress. I had to go back. There was so much more to write about. He held up his finger, and with a sage shake in his head, a patronizing smile, and a long, patient blink of his eyes, he said, "No one cares about Magna. No one knows where it is. You have to branch out, write about what's familiar to the greater audience." At that point, I had nothing left to say. I smiled, told him thank you, and filed his advice in a safe place where it wouldn't bother me, and went on writing. I went on writing because the story itself, though entirely fictional, was Magna. A very subjective Magna, but it was the little corner near the point of the West Mountains at the edge of the Great Salt Lake that I knew and loved, and was brimming with untold treasure chests of stories. It was the salad of imagery that filled the mind of a shirtless teenage boy, longish hair blowing in the wind, Judas Priest screaming through his headphones, the tender bruise under his eye felt every time he blinked, the heat of the bleaching asphalt under his bike tires, the drying tears on his cheeks. I combed over each scene, fighting to stay true to the physical setting, turning the Magna of 1984 itself into a fictional character, though not wanting to lose even a brick of an old building, a crack in a sidewalk, or a piece of shattered glass in the dirty gutters. I named no one. Not one local character in the book ever existed. The historical characters, for this book floats on heavy elements of historical fiction mixed with fantasy, never performed the acts depicted in the story. Though the story faithfully sticks to the timeline of that year, even like the local incorporation vote or the 1984 Summer Olympics passing by like scenery on a stage, it also unabashedly draws on, satirizes, and takes well out of context the unique political character of the township. That I confidently treat as sacrilegious as a young boy on a pig farm might take the once living batter of a hog, fill it with air, and kick it around like a ball. Today, Magna has 2 councils, a democratically elected town council and a private organization. Another council wholly unelected that acts as if it carried an authoritative share in the voice of the people to the ear of the county government. Those 2 councils didn't exist in 1984, but the politics that led to that unique and ongoing state of affairs did. The fictional West Ochre Council of In Older Worlds is not the council that served generationally through boom times and hard times, doing great things for the community, and whose members were well known and well beloved. This fictional story doesn't act as a history of Magna, nor reflects upon the real individuals who love and serve their community and hold its real history dear. As a dirty street-wizened punk, who looked a lot like Bogey in the story, once said outside the old Safeway on Main Street, knuckles dripping with blood, "I can say all I want about my family, but you say something, I break your face." Don't worry, he's a good old boy, and if you're with me, he won't bother you. Take my hands as we step into this worn trail through fields and backyards and alleyways, as we pass through the light into older worlds. I found this map in my brother's stuff when I helped box it up when we moved to our new house, Corey said. He cleared his throat. My parents held out hope for a long time. I mean, maybe Donnie was pissed for some reason and ran away. It's not like I cared to wear his clothes when I grew into them. By then we had the money to buy my own. The styles had changed a little by then. I didn't need hand-me-downs. I wouldn't be surprised if they're still in boxes in the loft of the garage. I get the feeling my parents still think he's alive. It gives me the creeps. You know, my mom never cried. Tossed it onto the coffee table. Do you mind if I take it and get a copy? Bogey asked. Keep it, Corey said. Bogey picked it up, held it, lightly touched the paper with his fingers. It trembled slightly. As he turned to leave, Corey stopped him with one last question. You were there, weren't you? Bogey didn't face him. He looked old, his long hair hanging unwashed, uncombed over his face, his shoulders hunched defensively under his black leather motorcycle jacket. Corey continued. You were with him when he disappeared. Bogey opened the door and faced the afternoon sun, which gave little warmth in the late autumn. A cold wind blew leaves over the yard. Yes, I was, he said, and attempted to close the door behind him. Corey swiftly caught it before it could shut. Then why don't you tell me what happened to my brother? Because I'm still trying to figure it out. Bogey briskly walked away. Before Corey could ask another question, Bogey mounted his motorcycle, aggressively kick-started it, then backed out onto the asphalt circle. He turned the wheel, put it into gear, and hit the gas. Not enough to peel out, but tiny rocks flew up and hit the neighbor's car. Asshole, Corey whispered, as he watched Bogey disappear around the corner. Prologue, Wednesday, October 1st, 1969. How did I get here? Cool air lifted a hand-drawn Beatles poster. Behind it, moonlight turned a bullet hole in the wall into a star. Stephanie Hardman, a.k.a. Meadowlark, swallowed, looked into her baby's shadowed face, then slowly detached him from her breast. The others in the room slept peacefully, mostly stoned, on their mattresses and sleeping bags. An old propane heater, stuffed in a fireplace, softly hissed. Meadowlark watched the door with fear and guilt and second thoughts. But if Mahesh really knew everything, why wasn't he stopping her? Why wasn't she dead already? Just thinking of him caused her head to pound with love and terror. He was her life, her soul, her universe. No devotion could have been as complete as hers until the baby came. Maybe Meadowlark deserved to die. Maybe she should hand her baby to the new girl, as Mahesh had ordered, then confess her weakness and ingratitude. The thought of confession felt sweet, a way to unburden herself. He was merciful. Perhaps her confession would bring mercy, especially if she ratted on Dennis Fish, a.k.a. Doggy. Which was worse, having her throat slit and her baby's losing his mother completely, or letting Doggy take the fall and living to see her baby grow, even if in the arms of a different mother? She would face several hours of self-criticism, if not several days, but after that it would all be forgotten. She could go on. That's what this was all about. His wisdom, his glorious wisdom. This was a test. Mahesh hoped she would confess. Doggy was one of Mahesh's chief lieutenants, wasn't he? Mahesh needed people he could trust, people who would sacrifice their very lives, even something dearer than that, their own children. Pride swelled in her heart. A flood of images from her religious working-class childhood, the dreary, endless hours of Sunday school, passed through her mind like a vision. Still hazy from the acid she'd been tripping on, she wasn't sure if it really wasn't a vision. God had commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. As he raised the knife, an angel spared him. He got to keep Isaac in God's favor. And when two women, both mothers of infant sons, one alive, one dead, approached the wise King Solomon for a judgment, both women claiming to be the mother of the live child, Solomon ordered the child to be cut in two. The true mother was revealed when she pleaded that the child be given to the other woman to spare his life. This was Meadowlark's divine test. For who else could come up with something so brilliant but Mahesh himself? She was supposed to rat on Doggy, who was under orders. Mahesh's wisdom would be revealed, and Meadowlark would be rewarded with her baby and with his favor, with his innermost trusted circle. He was Krishna, Mohammed, the Buddha, the Savior. He had saved her from that most odious enemy of mankind. Ego, self. A glow grew in her belly, and the smile of peace bloomed on her lips. I'll die for you. I'll kill for you, she thought, as she looked toward the darkened stairs. Her eagerness to confess nearly brought her to her feet, but Mahesh was asleep. She couldn't disturb his rest when his work was so important. She would wait, not for Doggy's signal, but for the sun to rise. In the power of the morning light, she would surrender herself to Mahesh, lie down at his feet, and kiss them, then bask in his love. So, how did I get here? The first time she saw him was on the way to San Francisco. It was the spring of 1967. She was 16, free, turned on to a new life, hardly looking back at what she thought of as the stiff, structured world in Utah that she'd left behind. A runaway poet. She'd hitched a ride with some college kids who took her as far as Berkeley. Left alone and penniless under the arches of Sather Gate, entrance to the University of California campus, she saw him on a blanket, his long, dark Jim Morrison hair and loose, unbuttoned shirt so clean, an Adonis in the form of a panhandler. He played a strange musical instrument before a gathering crowd. The metal strings sounded exotic, something she couldn't resist. She found a place to sit on the concrete while everyone else stood, except for a hippie girl who leaned her head against the greenish, ornate metalwork of the gate. Her eyes were closed, and she rocked back and forth in mild ecstasy. Though San Francisco was only a few miles away, Stephanie felt in no hurry. Experience and being were the purpose of existence. She was there, in that place, because she was meant to be there. The mysterious whine and twang of the strings vibrated in her mind like an answer, a guide to all else. She looked the musician in the eyes and felt herself one with his movements. From time to time, he looked up at her, and she felt his energy connect with hers. When the music ended, he held his fingers over the strings until the sound faded into nothing. His eyes stared at the space between himself and Stephanie for a long time. She watched him, expecting another performance. Instead, his dark eyes rose, and she fell into his stare. "Yes, you may," he said. He looked at her with love. For a moment she couldn't speak. She glanced around at the crowd. By the way all attention seemed to focus on her, there was no doubt who he was talking to. I'm sorry, I don't know." "Yes, you do," he said. "You may play this if you want," he said. He'd read her mind. She'd thought just how groovy it would be to try out that strange guitar. She felt cold and warm at the same time, forcing herself not to be shy. She stood up and walked to the blanket. He moved over to allow her some room, then carefully helped the instrument over her lap. "Sit like this, with your right leg in over the left, not cross-legged, a yoga position. It's easier that way. You can rest it on your knee," he said. She thought, "What is it?" It's a sitar, he said smoothly, as if her inner question had been part of the conversation. A tremor went through her chest, and he gently reached around her shoulders to lift the neck. He smelled like a mixture of old leather, smoke, and something wild. He could have been in his early 30s, twice her age, but then again maybe 10 years younger than that. She liked the way his chest felt against her shoulder. Something deep inside her made her feel the need to lean against him, and she succumbed, surprising herself. "That's it," he said. "Let yourself be free. You can do anything if you're free." The hippie girl who had been leaning against the metalwork straightened and seemed interested. Stephanie wanted to giggle like a bashful little girl, but she composed herself to act more mature, more sophisticated. "Okay, what do I do now?" He gently took her right hand and pressed her thumb to the bottom of the neck, where a joint connected it to the gourd-like body. "This is your access point. Let your arm rest. Relax it. That way you can move your hand." He stroked her forearm, and she couldn't relax. "Now use these 2 fingers." He took the forefinger and the middle finger of her left hand, held them gently, then touched her thumb and pressed it against her fingers. "Feel that?" She nodded. "That's how you want to press." His fingers stroked the space between her thumb and forefinger. "That's where the neck rests." He then placed her hand under the neck, as he would have a guitar, but the instrument was much wider. "Now you need this." He took a funny wire contraption off the tip of his right forefinger and slipped it over hers, as he would have a ring. "That's your pick. You pluck the strings with it." After a pause, while she put her hands into place, he backed away. She instantly missed his touch. He watched her with an encouraging smile. "Okay, here it goes." She pressed the fingers of her left hand onto a fret and plucked with her right hand. The richness of the sound surprised her, and she faltered. When she tried again, a twangy whine escaped into the air. She slipped her fingers up the frets as she had watched him do. The tones rose clumsily, almost in a minor scale, ending in a major scale. The surrounding group clapped. "What did I tell you?" he asked, his voice slipping over her shoulder. Giving it another try, she played around with the strings until her fingers hurt. "Like a meadowlark," he said. "Pretty as a meadowlark. That's your name. That's who you are." "My name is No." He shook his head and radiated love. "That's your old life, what you left behind. Here you're free to be a meadowlark." Stephanie Meadowlark smiled and felt as though she'd known him forever. "I knew you the moment you sat on the ground, while the others stood. A mark of humility," he whispered. "And you too," he said to the hippie girl behind him. She sat forward, as if surprised. "Me? You think I didn't notice?" Stephanie Meadowlark exchanged a perplexed glance with the hippie girl. "That's right. I felt your energy." "You're Sahaja," he said. "A natural healer and teacher. You were born with it." The hippie girl's eyes widened, almost fearfully, worshipfully. He nodded and smiled humbly. "Do you have someplace to go?" he asked Meadowlark, for Stephanie had disappeared from her heart. "San Francisco," she said, "but as far as a place to crash—" He shifted and took Sahaja's hand, stroked it and kissed it with profound, almost tearful reverence, then took Meadowlark's, which had held the neck of the sitar, and joined them, and they clasped. "Sisters," he said. "Tribal sisters." Looking at Sahaja, he said, motioning with his hand to Meadowlark, "Take care of this one. She's an ember in the wind, just a child." Sahaja nodded. His demeanor changed. The magic had blown away in the breeze. He lifted the sitar off Meadowlark's lap and handed it up to a fellow leaning against a stone pillar. "Thanks, man, that was a trip." Her new mysterious friend stood and stretched. She didn't want him to go. "What's your name?" she asked, and reached out and touched his sandaled foot. He caressed her hair and said, "I have no name, but Mahesh will do." Sahaja stood, and so did Meadowlark. "That's not your sitar?" Sahaja asked. He shrugged. "Mine, yours, everyone's. It was all of ours for a moment. He gave the true owner a brotherly nod and smile and pat on his shoulder. Sahaja took hold of his shirt sleeve. Where did you learn to play like that? Another humble, almost bashful smile adorned his face, like a string of jewels. First time. Beginner's luck, I guess. Sahaja looked as if she wanted to kneel down before him. He reached out and embraced her. A tear slid down her cheek. Will I see you again? She asked. Of course. It's in our karma. It's a powerful thing, karma. It is, she said, and wiped away the tear. He reached out and drew Meadowlark into a tender embrace. She felt herself yield to him, as if she would to a lover. Soon, he whispered. You still have a journey to take. San Francisco? Yes, she whispered. We'll watch for each other at Hayden Ashbury. Do you know where that is? Meadowlark shook her head. That's okay, you will soon. He left both girls standing at the gate to Berkeley and disappeared into campus. Meadowlark wanted more than anything to hold on to him, to make her journey one with his. But he was right. She still had her own journey to take. Late that evening, under a violent sunset, she reached the corner of Haight and Ashbury with Sahaja at her side, and as the song said, she hadn't forgotten to put some flowers in her hair. Cold mountain air whispered through the old farmhouse. Meadowlark felt her first real tear of regret break through the icy mask of devotion that had become her face. The smile of peace on her lips was only a crust. The Hell's Angels were due to arrive by the coming afternoon, and she would probably be chosen to show them special hospitality. She already knew she needed medical attention, especially antibiotics. Some days were better than others, but she sat in the dark, though craving the love and acceptance of Mahesh. She felt she couldn't offer any more service in his name. Something else she would have to confess. An outbuilding door, not properly closed for the night, softly banged, a distant lonely sound. She looked out the window and saw silhouettes of cottonwood trees and pines under indifferent stars. Inside the house, darkness swirled, a thick mixture, like muddy oil. She imagined herself tiptoeing out the door, leaving Doggy and Mahesh's elaborate tests behind, walking to the river, and, together with her baby, plunging into its black waters. The thought felt sweet, and she asked herself, how long would it hurt? As Mahesh had said, he appeared a few weeks later, a vision of prophethood, parting the shining seas of beautiful people crowding Haight Street. His white linen shirt with leg of mutton sleeves, faded hand-patched jeans, and leather sandals shouldn't have stood out among the throngs moving in and out of Golden Gate Park. But there he was. He raised his arms from his sides, reminding Meadowlark of the many paintings of Jesus she'd seen. And she felt as if her heart sailed over the surrounding San Francisco hills. Distant sounds of the Grateful Dead pushed through the muggy June air. Sahaja had led a group of friends and roommates to the park to participate in the summer solstice dew-in. Meadowlark had heard Jefferson Airplane was playing somewhere near the polo grounds, so she decided to tag along instead of staying behind to mend a used baby doll dress she'd picked up at a flea market for 75 cents. A shouting kid in a top hat and Lincoln beard was peddling an underground newspaper he called a dirty hippie paper. Bare feet and moccasins swished along the sidewalk. Beads rattled and colorful art adorned storefronts. Several people danced atop a Volkswagen bus. Love to you, a man said, and handed her a flower. Thank you, she said warmly, taking it, but her smile was aimed at the approaching apparition that defied the heavy overcast that turned distant hilltops into faded dreamscapes. My beautiful tribe, Mahesh said, extending his hands as far as he could, as if wanting to embrace the whole group. Sahaja was the first to land in his arms. A ripple of jealousy tickled Meadowlark, but she continued to smile and take the not-so-eager approach. Soon she had her moment, as he whispered in her ear, "It wasn't soon enough, beautiful. You are so beautiful." He hadn't whispered anything to Sahaja. After a round of introductions was made, he naturally took the lead, dancing and gliding and flattering until even the men seemed to fall in love with him. When the evening ended, the group, of which some had no permanent home, but moved from pad to pad, all gathered over a pot of rice in an upper apartment that overlooked Clayton Street. A girl from downstairs brought up fresh lemons to squeeze over the rice to make it taste better. Pot smoke permeated the room. Mahesh sat under a cheap Ben Sahan poster of a man wearing an old-fashioned military uniform. The caption underneath read, Le Capitaine Dreyfus. Having no idea who Capitaine Dreyfus was, she immediately associated the uniform with the uniforms the Beatles wore on the cover of their new album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Until a few weeks before, the only song she'd known from it by heart was the one the radio incessantly played, With a Little Help from My Friends. Since then, several people in her circle had picked up the record. The current song of the day was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Soon the circle of people in the room changed from its egalitarian formation to an orientation focused on the newest edition, who spoke passionately of master and slave moralities. Feeling the merriment of the past few days catching up to her, she lay at his feet and drifted in and out of sleep. The conversation, mainly his, drifted to the white oppression of blacks and the coming revolution. The LBJ Society wasn't great. This was no longer Eisenhower's society. Civilization was falling apart. Western culture was a big prison, a turkey farm for the slave masters. Freedom was something you paid for in Vietnam blood. Blood would soon run in the streets of America. When the night turned to early morning, Meadowlark asked him if he had a place to stay. He said, The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. She knew instantly whom he was quoting, yet she felt as though she were hearing those words for the very first time, as if he were their author. Before anyone else could speak, and before Sahanja, who was 10 years older than Meadowlark and had become a big sister to her, could make a move, Meadowlark sat up and said, Here's a place for you to rest your head. And then she pulled him down into her lap and stroked his long hair and beard. Well, I've had enough for the night, Sahanja said, and left the room. Meadowlark didn't try to see the look on her face. She only wanted that moment. Whatever else would come would come. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wadded-up paper bag. He unraveled it and withdrew a sugar cube. Though partial to pot, she'd avoided most other drugs floating around, especially LSD. She'd seen a few bad trips. He held it to her lips. Take. Eat. No thanks. She stroked the dark hairs of his arm. Again, he touched it gently against her lips. She didn't turn away, but looked down at his strong neck, his mature, slightly sweaty chest, and then the shape of his hips and legs, the way they filled his jeans. She studied a strange stone attached to a gold chain that hung around his neck. There's a first time for everything, he said softly. I'll guide you through it. There are so many wonderful things to see. Something inside her said, make an excuse. She saw herself going to the bathroom or standing up and saying she needed to go on a walk, maybe taking him with her through the moody San Francisco streets. Instead, she felt the pressure of his fingers against her lips. She relaxed, let them part. The sugar cube slipped between them, and her tongue caught it. Mahesh looked up at her and lovingly stroked her cheeks, then her neck, then her shoulders, then her chest. She enjoyed the way it made her feel. Slowly, the sugar cube melted on her tongue. She fought the urge to crush it with her teeth, just to get it over with. As the time passed, nothing happened. He sat up and kissed her, slowly shifting position until, naturally, she lay on the floor. As the kissing became more passionate, the thought that the LSD should be something they did together began to nag at her. Taking his bearded face in her hands, instead of thinking of him as sexy, she thought of him as ridiculous, and she stopped him and asked, What about you? What about me? He stared into her eyes, then resumed kissing her neck and slowly unbuttoned her shirt. Why don't you drop too? His long hair fell into her face, and, for a moment, it seemed to fall from a great distance. He swished it back and forth like a broom, and she had the urge to bite it. It was my last one, he said. She'd clearly seen the bag when he'd opened it. There was more inside. She reached for his pocket. He shifted her hand to place it elsewhere and smiled. Whether he did some himself or not probably didn't matter. What bothered her was that he would lie. But the more he touched her, the more she wanted to lock that thought away behind some inner door and just let him love her. After a few more minutes, she felt as if her tired head had cleared. She wanted to be awake and experience every moment. She began to talk about herself, reciting what he'd missed since the day they'd met at the university gates. "What are your parents like?" he asked, then nibbled on her ear. It took her a moment to respond because her ear suddenly felt twice as large and his teeth felt like fangs, sexy fangs. "They act like bourgeois pigs." He nodded his head, then looked deep into her eyes. His face was the only place that existed, as big as a drive-in movie screen. Hers was a smear, a pile of dust, smudging into the floor. "What is your dad like?" "A hypocritical bastard. He cheated on my mom, got excommunicated from their church, and then had the gall to come tell me I needed to be clean and pure." "Did he ever apologize?" "In his own way, I guess. I could never look at him again without thinking of that other woman, especially when he'd supposedly straightened out his life. My mom never left him." "Wow. Don't you, think that should be a good thing?" "I don't know. It's like he became a stranger. Maybe I'm the stranger." "He wounded you." Meadowlark didn't say anything. The pain of her home life became too real, and all she wanted was to escape it and start a new life. "I can heal you," he said, and he pressed her flat against the floor, like a piece of paper. She was in the floor. She was the floor. A small peace sign drawn over the door with the word "Pox" written underneath it became something chilling and sinister. She would have to get a rag and some cleaner and remove it before it cursed the room. Later, in the thin light before the sun rose, and in the cool breeze under an open window, Meadowlark would find herself passionately embracing him, flowing with his rhythms, and he would breathlessly whisper in her ear, "Think of your father. Think of your father." The black bundles on the floor weren't really her sleeping tribe. They were dead bodies. Death was everywhere. It filled the old farmhouse with its crushing presence. Even her baby was dead. Painted on the wall, barely perceptible, was a figure sitting in the lotus position, a silhouette emanating rays. Dots of various colors rose in a straight line from groin to head, Mahesh's path to nirvana. It stood out, blurred and gray, an evil spirit that would step from the wall at any moment, quietly walk around her, its face the abyss, and she would go insane. On the other wall, in fresh blood red that looked dark gray, was painted a goat. In the center of one eye was the communist hammer and sickle. This she refused to look at. All the dark bodies stirred at once, their heads turned, and white cataract eyes opened to stare directly at her. Feeling a horrible shock, she awoke from the nightmare. She gripped her baby and felt for his breath. Another tear turned cold on her cheek. Feeling pain from sitting too long, she stood and quietly paced in front of the window. The despairing thought that she might have missed Doggy's signal grew inside her like mold. What use would it be to turn him in now? But then, what if her chance to escape was real? And she missed it. The tribe's first major communal decision was on the day they bought the old school bus. Ken Kesey's famous bus ride was already legend, so in a sort of tribute to Kesey, but also out of economic need, Mahesh had found the vehicle through a mechanic friend who worked in Napa Valley. The latest owner had used it to haul bees, screening off the driver's section, of course. Everyone pooled what cash they had, plus a few favors Sahaja agreed to provide, and the bus was theirs. Mahesh's, but the title would carry the name of Dennis Fish, a regular among their group and a good mechanic. They abandoned the apartment on Clayton Street and split, setting out on the road to escape the man. The bus made it to Chihuahua, Mexico, before its first major breakdown. Everyone was positive and hip for adventure, so it wasn't a terrible setback. Dennis, Doggy, was in charge of repairs, which required some creative wheeling and dealing to acquire engine parts. In some cases, a few of the group managed to find some day labor for a few pesos, which mostly ended up buying beer, marijuana, and a few tortillas. Local peach farms, which were in season by then, provided many of their meals. The farmers, unknowing. Meadowlark discovered nopales and how to prepare and cook them through a lady she washed clothes for. And then came the time when Sahaja, who had studied Spanish in high school, disappeared for 2 days and then returned with a 20-pound sack of rice roped onto her back. Happiness permeated their world. For a while. Driving along dusty highways in red sunsets, they set out for ancient ruins and empty beaches. Mahesh would read aloud from some of the many books he kept in an old military locker. One favorite was On the Road by Jack Kerouac. He would reverently go back and reread parts for emphasis, then say, "Do you feel it? It's karma." On clear nights, lulled to sleep by the surf, Meadowlark would lie in Sahaja's arms, safe in her sisterly embrace. In the mornings they would wade, hand in hand, through the ebbing tide and pick up shells, of which they would make jewelry. Out of clamshells, they fashioned bikini tops, which became hits among the other girls, and wore them nearly constantly, when they weren't topless, burning themselves as brown as the locals. Wreaths of small shells adorned their sun-dried hair. After sundown, they would dance around the bonfire as Doggy played the guitar, passing the peace pipe and drinking cool fruit juice mixed with tequila. Month after month, the little band of gypsies traveled the coast, gathering fellow revelers, surfers, and wanderers, and the love increased. Mahesh preached apocalyptic tempests while everyone moved with his words in dreamy mescaline grooves. Nature, even the weather, was their cradle. Paradise couldn't have been as free and perfect. Then things began to change. Meadowlark would always associate one night in particular with the beginning of the end. It was the night she went on a moonlit walk along the beach and stumbled upon Mahesh and Sahaja in a love embrace. She began to turn away when Mahesh asked, "Where are you going?" Meadowlark simply smiled and said, "I'll leave you two to your private moment," and turned to leave. "Nothing's private here," Mahesh said. "We share everything. Come." Knowing she should reject society's programming in every way possible, she abandoned herself to stranger passions. Drugs helped to numb away the inner warning voices. "Shit's going down," Mahesh said. He'd taken the chain from around his neck and stared at the stone. With the other hand, he withdrew a knife and used the blade to move the stone around as it reflected the light of the distant bonfire. Since when did he start carrying a knife? Meadowlark asked herself, feeling sore and cold and exposed to the elements. As he pulled up his pants, his white glowing legs disappeared behind denim. Meadowlark watched his movements and thought he looked old. He sheathed the knife. "We're going back," he said. Sahaja sat up and shook the sand out of her hair. The wind began to blow and the surf grew louder. His face seemed to disappear in the shadows. "That's right. We are going back to the belly of the beast. To the Rocky Mountains this time. Shit's going down." Then his eyes, as if floating in the middle of nothing, turned to Meadowlark. He touched her belly. "And this is where the world starts over." How could he have known? She asked herself, then bowed down and kissed his feet. She hadn't said a word, but during the past few weeks she had felt different, sometimes nauseous in the mornings, and had missed a period. Sahaja stared at her, the look on her face unreadable. Later that night, Sahaja claimed to have had a vision. At first, Meadowlark thought she was into the music, tripping, swaying back and forth and humming, but then the shaking set in. Her eyes rolled back to where only the whites showed. She crept among the party like an aboriginal shaman, jerking and moaning, and then she stopped before Meadowlark, who froze in terror, and placed her hands on Meadowlark's belly. The things that howled from her mouth left Meadowlark curled on the ground and weeping like a child. The signal came. Doggy lit a cigarette near the window. The flame made a ghostly image of his face, which then disappeared. Losing strength, she nearly let herself fall back onto the chair. But a weak foot took one step forward, then the other. She found the kitchen door and carefully avoided the creaking floorboards. The dead light from the window revealed black shapes of guns stacked along the walls and ammunition spread across the table. Gripping her baby, she carefully turned the doorknob, then froze. Soft shuffles, almost footsteps, came through the ceiling. He's awake. He knows. Strength hemorrhaged from her body. She wanted more than anything to fall onto her hands and knees and weep in submission. Her shaking breath was the only sound until her baby stretched in her arms and let out a little grunt. She felt his hand move, and she knew he was sucking his thumb. He was awake. Something happened inside her chest and head, something electrical that caused her to grit her teeth, widen her eyes. Gasping, she eased the cracking door open and slipped out. Her body tensed against the cold night air, and she tucked the blanket over her baby's face. As she stepped off the porch and past the sound of sleeping chickens, the electrical feeling increased, and she ran across the yard. Rounding the bus, she nearly collided with the battered old farm truck they'd stolen from a nearby town. She reached out and swung at the air like a blind person. She ducked a tree branch and felt the crunch of leaves under her feet. Out of nowhere, a large form seized her around the neck. Another hand covered her mouth. She nearly fainted as Doggy's voice, warm against her ear, hushed her and said, "This way." She felt him carefully let go. He took her hand, and together they found the overgrown ruts of an old dirt road that led to the river. She nearly stumbled trying to keep up. The road widened into meadows. Doggy pulled her out of the moonlight and into the tree shadow. As they moved, the song Eve of Destruction played over and over again through her head. My friend. Her friend. Her love. Her truth. She was abandoning him at the hour he most needed her. She slowed down and loosened her grip on Doggy's hand. They were somewhere near the place, she was sure, where Bruce and Alabama were buried. Bruce, their landlord no more. Alabama, a threatening snitch no more. Her fingers slid from Doggy's, but before she could turn back, he skidded to a stop and seized her by the Mexican blanket that covered her shoulders. She instinctively gripped her baby close and hunched forward to protect him. She took a breath to scream, and Doggy clapped his hand over her mouth, hurting her lips. The pain and his intensity brought her attention to where she thought his face would be. Only darkness. Mountain cold filled the loose places in her clothes. He said through his teeth, "This is our only chance. He'll bury you here, too. You know that. You can't turn back now. You can't lie to him." He gripped her hand, tugging it. She felt as if other hands pulled her the opposite direction. Black hands. Dirty hands. Dead hands. The baby fussed. She gave in and let Doggy lead her to the river, where they crossed through the knee-deep water. Her legs cramped, causing her to slow down. She continued to hold the baby, steadying herself over the slick, rounded rocks and the force of the water. On the other side, she ached in the breeze. Lights from a house several miles away sent a dreamy message from a life she'd forgotten. Exhausted and hurting, she barely felt her feet scrape along the dirt road. They crossed a bridge of old railroad ties. From there she could see headlights shoot by on the highway. Doggy lifted his Zippo lighter, which reflected moonlight, and flicked it. The flame shone for a moment, but quickly went out. He kept doing it, defying the moving air, until, up ahead, another tiny flame appeared. He let out a long sigh. "Who's that?" Meadowlark asked, her teeth chattering. The baby fussed and squirmed under the blanket. "Friends," Doggy said. Filled with dread, but too exhausted to run, she let him lead her to a small group of silhouettes standing in the road. The test was over. She'd failed. Tears filled her eyes, and she wept for her baby. Doggy fiercely hugged one of the silhouettes. He flicked his lighter. In the flame, Meadowlark saw the tribal member she knew as Warlock. Others stepped forward, and she searched for Mahesh, knowing the end was near. "I couldn't leave without her," Doggy said. "We know." Warlock gripped him by the hair, and they touched, forehead to forehead, a brotherly gesture. "You okay?" A voice came from the group, and Meadowlark realized it was directed to her. Tender hands reached out and touched her cheek. "Is the baby okay?" It was Sandy, one of the girls whose nickname never stuck, who also held a baby. "I'm cold," Meadowlark said. Doggy whispered in her ear, "Let's go." Feeling confused, she let him lead her to a jeep concealed in the brush on the side of the road. She started to ask, "But how?" Mahesh only thought it broke down, Doggy said. She could picture his mischievous smile, and for the first time since she could remember, she felt hope. He helped her to the front passenger seat, where she would sit on Warlock's lap and tuck the blanket around her. The others found places, packed like sardines, in the back seat. Doggy fired up the engine, put it into gear, and the old army jeep bounced and rattled over bushes until it hit a dirt road. He didn't turn on the headlights. The road passed under them like a dark river. Her baby began to cry, and so did she. When they reached the highway, she curled herself against Warlock to protect the baby from the icy wind. Occasionally she looked back, expecting the old bus or the farm truck to be following them, but the only headlights she saw were from other innocent travelers. The canyon steepened. Doggy shifted to a lower gear, and the wheels whirred. She buried her head in her blanket. For a while she listened to her baby. When she looked again, she saw what seemed to her to be the canyon walls moving apart, and below them were the lights of the Salt Lake Valley, glittering like a spilled treasure box. End of prologue.